Hi, my name's Chris, and I'm going to talk to you about you. That's right, you might be surprised by some of the things I'll go over, or perhaps it'll just give you a better understanding of some of the ideas you might have already had. In this video, I'll be going over theories of the self. So let's begin. And let's start by asking, who are you? Take a moment to actually ponder this question. What are some of the things that make you, you? If you're confused, then let me rephrase. Why are you, you? That's the main question we'll try to answer here today. And to help you think about this idea, and to help us answer this question, I'm going to ask you more questions. So let's get started. Are you the things you do? Say you play a sport. You might consider yourself an athlete. This is often the case with our job or our career. Our occupation and hobbies take up a great amount of our time, so maybe it makes sense that the things we do are a part of what makes you, you. But let's ask another question. Are you your thoughts? This one's tricky, but what I really mean is whether you are how you feel or how you think about yourself from moment to moment. Does your sense of self change just like your thoughts and feelings change? This question can go even further, and we could even ask if our unconscious feelings and thoughts make up who we are. In other words, are the things going on in our head that we're not aware of also us? Here's another question. Are you the people around you? Do you do the things that your group of friends do? Do you dress like those around you? Do you feel and think similar to those who are close to you? You probably said yes to one of those things. And we can often see how other people act and think like others around them. So maybe our sense of self is developed by the people around us. Next, are you who you want to be? This question is kind of like the question about your thoughts. But in this case, I'm asking you if who you want to be is always who you are. Is who you want to be always who you present yourself as? Or perhaps the person we want to be may not always correspond with who we are. So, I've asked you a bunch of questions to try to think about why you are who you are. And these are questions that scientists have actually explored, or at least thought about. And these scientists are psychologists. Psychology is a science that explores the mind and behavior. So psychologists who are interested in this idea of the self have created theories to try and describe what is going on. And they do this through research, because this is science after all. That being said, the first person we'll talk about didn't really put his ideas to the test. Instead, his ideas were kind of just his own ideas. But nonetheless, this is part of where it all started, with Sigmund Freud. This is a name you might have heard of. Freud is a well-known figure who contributed many of his own thoughts and ideas about the way people thought and behaved, even though he didn't really explore them much with experiments. But he sort of laid out a basis for researchers in the future. His ideas that we're interested in for this video are about the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud came up with this idea of the id, which he thought of as our natural instincts. You can think of these instincts like animal instincts. So these instincts involve things like aggression, sex drive, or other pleasure-seeking behaviors. Freud's main point here, though, was that these instincts were not something we thought about. They were just these natural urges and desires that we possess without even thinking about them. On the other side, we have the superego, which you can think of like our superhero part of ourself. Remember, we're thinking about part of ourself, who we are. So Freud thought that the superego was the part of ourself that considered things like laws and rules, like walking the crosswalk when you have the light to do so, or maybe wearing a mask during the time of a pandemic. It's the thoughtful part of ourself, but it isn't always a natural instinct. Freud thought that the superego was developed by those around us, like our society, culture, and parents. Finally, there's the ego. Basically, the ego is what you get when you put these two things together. The ego tries to find balance. It is the judgments and decisions you make about your other thoughts. Freud thought that the ego was the part of you that you control. So Freud, about 100 years ago, came up with these ideas to explain what the self is. He thought that the id, the ego, and the superego were what made up who you are. From there, researchers took Freud's ideas a step further and developed theories that were a bit more in line with the science part of science. Erikson is one of those people. Erikson came up with what is known as the Psychosocial Theory. His theory helps to explain how people achieve a healthy self. Basically, his whole idea is that people go through different stages in life, and during each stage, you can either grow from it or not. Probably the most important part of his theory for our talk about the self is his stage on identity versus role confusion. Identity is one of those terms that is quite similar to personality, or our sense of self. It is who we identify as, so it's probably important to who we are. This is a stage that typically occurs around adolescence, and that matches what an adolescent is probably thinking about throughout middle school and high school. Who their friend groups are, what sports they'll play, what cool clothes to wear, and perhaps most importantly, what to do for the rest of their life. Making it out of this stage of your life successfully means that you formed a solid sense of self. You are sure of who you are and what you want to do. And for you, maybe that's becoming a firefighter. So developing a good sense of identity, a better sense of you, allows you to better understand what you want to do. Or let's say you don't make it out of this stage successfully. Well, then according to Erikson, you'll just end up confused. And if you're like, yup, that sounds like me, then fear not. Because even though this stage is supposed to occur when you are entering into adulthood, some people remain in this stage for a good long while. But in the end, Erikson thought that this transition from childhood to adulthood was an extremely important time for developing your sense of self. Another important stage for our talk on the self is the last stage in Erikson's theory, integrity versus despair. This stage typically occurs when a person is an older adult. At this point, you are reflecting back on your life. You are thinking about whether you are happy with the life that you lived. If you're happy, then you develop a sense of integrity and accomplishment. If you're not happy with the life that you lived, then you probably develop a sense of despair or regret. And it's important to point out that successful development in earlier stages, like the one we just talked about, identity versus role confusion, helps to successfully accomplish later stages. So developing a strong sense of identity and purpose will then help us to be able to feel accomplished and proud of the self we developed and the life we lived when we look back and reflect. Okay, another idea about the self developed from other researchers comes from the Relational Self theory. This idea suggests that we are like those around us. In addition to that, it sort of says that we change ourselves when we are around other people. So we are different around different people. Our actual person changes. So this idea starts to open up the possibility that we don't just have one self. We have multiple. And another way to try to remember this is to think that we have different faces for different places. So our self is different in different environments. Okay, and moving on to our final idea of the self that we'll talk about today, going back to what I just said about having multiple selves, we'll be talking about the possible selves theory. So this idea is sort of telling us that we all have this desired self, our best self, this self that we want to be. This is called our ideal self. This might involve changing your physical appearance, like getting in shape, or this might be more psychological, like just changing your attitude. But our ideal self is the self we want to be. Then there's also the self we don't want to be. So you don't want to be that person who is aggressive or rude. Or maybe you don't want to seem like that person who is lazy or unmotivated. This is what we call the dread self. Again, that's the self you don't want to be. In the end, though, there is your actual self. That is who you actually are or feel like you are. And you usually want to move your actual self towards your desired self and away from the dread self. So your current self may not always be who you want it to be. And our sense of self is continuously changing. All right, well, that is all of the theories we'll be talking about today. We briefly went over a few of the common ideas that researchers have come up with to talk about the self. We talked about Freud, who played a big role in the modern ideas of the self, but he didn't really test his ideas with experiments. Still, his ideas created a base for the ideas that came after. For example, we talked about Erikson and how he thought that we developed our sense of identity during certain stages in our life. And for some of us, that stage is when we're teens. Also, successfully forming an identity can help us feel accomplished when we reach old age and reflect back on our life. And then we talked about the relational self theory, which was really about this idea that our self changes when we're with different people. And finally, we talked about the possible selves theory. And in this case, researchers think that we have our own image of our ideal self, which is who we want to be, and an image of a dread self, who we don't want to be. So going back to the questions I asked earlier, according to Freud, you are your thoughts, whether they're conscious or unconscious. You are also the things you do. According to Erikson, defining your identity is a big part of who you are, and so the career you choose and the things you do help play a role in defining your identity. You are also like the people around you. Your sense of self changes when you are around other people, so those around you influence who you are. And finally, who you want to be is important to who you are now. We tend to have an ideal self, and we often work to try to become that person. But at the end of the day, you are just you. There are lots of things we didn't talk about here that make you who you are. So even though we mentioned a couple of things that might make you you, each of us is unique. So there are lots of little differences that make each of us who we are. So appreciate your diversity, but also keep in mind that there are aspects out of our control that shape who we end up being in the moment.